Army Regulation 201, Environmental Quality, Environmental Protection and Enhancement. Chapter 15, Program Management and Operations, Structure and Resourcing. Army Environmental Funding Policy. Army organization are responsible for addressing environmental requirements for the steward for the activities under the purview of and to ensure timely compliance with legal mandates for sustaining environmental stewardship. Environmental requirements must be funded through the appropriate account with the proponent which has the responsibility for the action, necessarily installation program evaluation group or 2PEG environmental program accounts. Programming, budgeting, compensators with the responsibility Army organization to include tenants will plan and program, budget, execute, resource, mitigate actual imminent health and environmental hazards, comply with federal, state, and local statutes, regulations, agreements, and other judgments applicable to executive orders, final governing standards, and legally binding international agreements for the overseas installations. 3. Sustaining the quality and contained availability of lands and essential operation training of the testing of the protecting natural and cultural resources, maintaining adequately trained and staffed organization for the environmental monitoring and program management, employing cost-effective pollution prevention and reuse recycled-based solutions in all missions areas preferred with the approach for the meeting of compliance requirements, reducing operating costs, maintaining environmental stewardship, focusing on environmental quality, technology, research, innovation, and applications to achieve program goals and reduce program costs, address environmental quality costs associated with weapon system life cycle with the contents requirement for the life cycle cost estimate adequately assess the cost of the acquisition milestone review process, investment strategy. Harmony organizations will make prudent investments in environmental initiatives that support the mission accomplishment, enhancement, readiness, and reduce future funding of the needs, prevent mitigation population, improve the compliance, reduce the overall cost of the compliance with the applicable environmental requirements. Payment of the fines and penalty for the environmental violations. Fines, penalties, supplemental environmental projects, SEP costs will be paid with the organization against for the fine of the penalty as assigned using the applicable Army portions unless otherwise required by law. The payments and fines and penalties will be charged to the funds accounted for the operation causing the violation. Contractors' officers will ensure the contracts require contractors to pay fines and penalties resulting from their violations, their operations. Compliance and agreements, consent orders, compliance agreements, consent orders attributed to the tenant's mission and operation will be financed with the mission funds and must be coordinated with the mission chief of the command. 5.2 Environmental Quality Control Committee. The Installation of Establishment Environmental Quality Control Committee, chaired by the garrison commander and oversees the Environmental Quality Control. All committees may be organized at the appropriate military community level. The Environmental Quality Control Committee will include major sub-installation for the tenants. The Environmental Quality Control Committee will meet at least quarterly documented decision. The Environmental Quality Control Committee should consist of the members representing operational, logistics, engineering, planning, resources management, legal, medical, environmental, moral, welfare, recreation, MW or more welfare, recreation, commissioner, exchange services, safety, interest in the command, excluding the military installation, tenant activities. The Environmental Quality Control Committee will help to plan, execute, monitor activities programs with the environmental implications. Committees will identify the issue with the recommendation advised with the garrison commander. 15.3 Environmental Training and Awareness Competency. All persons who perform the tasks that can cause significant environmental impacts will component with the basis of the appropriate education and training. Experienced personnel and non-environmental managerial functions will be received with appropriate technical and awareness training. All organizations will identify training needs, including legally mandated training, documentation training taken, and evaluate effectiveness. The supervisors are responsible to ensure that employees are properly trained. Organization be used most effective, efficient education training source available, such as academia, private vendors, federal, state, local agencies, workshop, conference, distributed training. Army organization will develop the training course with only when such training courses do not exist. Proposal to develop the training course to coordinate with the higher headquarters training during command. The U.S. Army Engineering School is responsible for developing integrated environmental consideration into the personal training. All organizations will ensure applicable personnel at all levels conform with a single installation-wide environmental management system. 15.4. Communications. Internal organizations at levels will establish maintain procedure for the internal communication among all the levels and functions of the report environmental incidents. External organization at the levels establish maintain procedure for the receiving the documented responding to the communication of external interested parties and coordinate with the public affairs staff. The organization will be provided with the information publicly accessible and non-restricted for the Army environmental website that has been peculiarly released for the appropriate public affairs office. Information available to the public through the internet will be considered with the guidance issued by the Army and Chief of the Environment Information Officer, Garrison 6, CIO, Chief Information Officer. All environmental agreements must be reviewed and approved with the next higher echelon. Proposed agreements for the review will be consideration for the long-term Army resource commitments. Additionally, the environmental agreements will regulatory agencies will form with the command channel for the Judge Advocate environmental review prior to the signature, resulting with the tenant activities be coordinated with the Lieutenant Army Commands and Army Service Components Command, Direct Reporting Units, National Guard, Bureau of the Army National Guard, Installation Management Command. If applicable, Army elements will include public involvement component with the decision-making process to be build mutual understandings of interested parties through two-way communication dialogue. Will strive to reduce the miscommunication and foster mutual benefits exchanging of information. 15.5. Real property acquisition, leases, out grants, and disposal transactions. Comprehensive environmental response compensation liability act circular requires the Army to protect and circuit earn actions to assess the environmental condition prior property during the designated real property transaction. The transaction include a fee, acquisition of real property on the behalf of the United States that needs diversitying the title of the United States transferring jurisdiction between federal agency and lease of the Army controlled real property of the non-Army entities. To this section, not applicable to reassignment for the Army and the Department of Defense to the acquisition less than fee. Do other out grants, license easements, and permits, however, the environmental condition of the property requirement of the section applies to the matter of the policy of the DA license of the National Guard Bureau, the license for the State National Guard components to stand. Land acquisition for the land was provided with the federally funded construction and proponents conducted with the transactions in accordance with the procedure of the AR40510, AR40580, and 40590. Sections 268, Title 10, U.S. Standard Code, 32030, Title 32, CFR 651, and Part 800. Title 36 Code of Regulations, base alignment, the closures of assignment actions will comply with the Department of Defensive Instruction in 4165.66M or its successor. The Army proponent may elect to perform the environmental site assessment for the inapplicable transactions. Except as noted as being above the access, the Army will access determine the documentation of environmental condition with the transfer priority of the environmental control ECP. The ECP report will summarize historical control environmental conditions, including reference to publicly available the related portions, studies, and permits. The report will provide an Army an accurate summary of the environmental condition of the property. The property will be deeded to the lease of the site, and may additionally cite a characterization to meet applicable regulatory requirements or help to value the property. Note, the Garrison Committee of the Army proponent is responsible for initiating the ECP report. And an ECP report is normally resolved with the consideration regarding the visibility of the transaction forms of the basis of the findings and sustainability if action is transaction, environmental contamination, potential environmental liabilities associated with the properties being considered for the acquisition, lease, and disposal will be determined prior to the completing of the transaction. ECP report, if applicable, the finding is a sustainable or integral part of the report. Availability disposable report, which form the basis of the Army official and delegated with the authority to approve the real property transaction for the U.S. Army Corps Engineering to provide the required legal documented land use control convention covenants finding the stability is required for the BRAC disposals, both transfer, lease, and both are not required for active installation use leases. 42 U.S. Standard Code 9620. H. Content of the ECP report depends on the nature of the transaction proposed of the transfer and lease. Transfer and leases between the Army and non-federal entities will require a minimum Phase 1 ECP report where the conditions indicate the unnecessary regarding condition of the property. The Phase 2 ECP report is also required. The ECP report will comply with the applicable American Standards Testing Material Standards and the ASTM E1527, E1903, and D6008 will be consistent with the Department of Defense based redevelopment realignment manual for BRAC actions. The ECP report is an additional optional reassignment for the Army in between Army and other DoD component depending on the headquarters Department of Army authority depends and deems it's necessary. Reassignment within the ECP report should have the statement describing the environmental conditions with the packaging forward to headquarters Department of Army. For non-BRAC actions, the ECP report will be attached to the environmental section for the report of availability disposal report AR405 80 and 40590 that's submitted with the Army decision-making official. Visa acquisition state card components for will be provided with the federally funded construction of the EC report to comply with the Environmental Protection Agencies. All property requiring with the rules of CIRCULA, provided with the obtaining of the real property to provide the defense of the CIRCULA liability and innocent landowner bond fine, prospective purchaser, contingency property owner, reduce the risk of the Army to ensure that pays the appropriate consideration for the property. The Army component will perform the due diligence determined with the environmental condition of the property where applicable Environmental Protection Agency guidelines and applicable association and testing materials, standards of real acquisition, and the activity of initiating the proper transfer or lease will include the ECP report for the disposal report reporting the availability of the transaction. D. Active installation, lease or non-lease, out grants, easements or liens, or easement licenses or permits. The environmental side of the report of ability will be used to document the environmental condition of the property being leased for the activities of the no requirement to prepare the FSOL with the non-bracket ECP included with the report of availability, included the appendix appropriate for the environmental protection provision necessary to commit and in human health and environmental protection. The garrison commander of the National Guard Bureau has been accountable, or the NG National Guard have accountability of the real property installation to determine the environmental section of the report of availability and making sufficient documentation of environmental requirements for the permanent lease easements and similar real estate where environmental concerns are very minor. Under these circumstances, the ECP report would not be required. The ECP report will be done in exemption for the section of licenses are issued. The National Guard components of the hazardous material will be stored for 1 year or more and disposed of the Army property except from the authorized by the Title 10 U.S. Standard Code 2692, as amended with the authorized with the Army lands facilities posed with the hazardous to human health and environment, leasing space, and the other trailers of the actual teller machines. Automatic teller machines does not require the ECP report except for the extraordinary circumstances exists. The garrison commander is responsible for determining the appropriate ECP category ASTM D57464 for the property being transferred being on the result of the ECP report action taken and administrated contained with the PD. For real property transaction initiated with the non-Army party initiating transaction responsible for funding completing with the EC report, the garrison committee and the Army proponents should be approved of the EC report. The Army may prepare an EC report even though the others initiated the transaction is demonstrable to the Army for the non-BRAC transfer of the GSA, the disposable agent Army to prepare the EC report. However, the disposal by the GCA is not considered the transfer of the jurisdiction of the GCA. Level detail of the EC report will be coordinated with the GCA PD. Findings to sustainability are listed below. The finding is suitable and transfer to transfer and finding suitable for early transfer of the FOSS and FOSSET. Bracket finding the sustainability of the lease and the fossil will certify the property of the compatible with the proposed use and that restrictions remedy in the place of the protection of human health and environmental with deeds diversifying titles leases executed with the BRAC and other special legislative authority will produce only after the FOSS, FOSSET, and FOSSEL. The FOSSET is required transferring the property to pursuant to the provisions of Circular 120H3C and the early transfer authority where remedial action has been not completed with the transfer of the Circular 120H3C PD. A FOSS is not required for deed diverse vesting titles when disposed of the General Service of Administration. Responsible for the environmental remediation for the transfer interchange between the Army and federal entities will be addressed memorandum of agreement between the Army and the transferee. The Army requires the EC report, which will be initiated per paragraph 5, provided with the transfer. With the 6th, the brain bracket fossils will coordinate with the regulators, make available to the public there. Review approval authorities enlisted below. Installation Management Command, Army Command Service Component Commands, direct reporting units will special installation for the Army National Guard will review the approve of the ECP reports and coordinate with the effective organization. Approval authorities, ECP report, fossil, BRAC fossil documents, property disposal are tabled in 15.1. The Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army, Environmental Safety, Occupational Health, and will recommend approval of the free acquisition property with the Environmental Quality Control Program, Environmental Control Program category designation of 5 and above, with the known as suspected munitions specific concerns. Recommended approval to proceed with the transfer of the non-defensive of the federal agency's properties will know and is suspected the military explosive of the concern. Approve the FOSS bracket fossils. Approve the ECP report for the non-bracket lease of the properties will known and insert secured munitions of the munitions explosive of the concern and approve faucet. Approval of all faucet. The approval official will ensure the documentation received the appropriate legal environmental professional review prior to the arriving approving of the document. Real property transaction preparation appropriate for the National Environmental Policy Documentation Peer 32 CFR 1651. Lease termination. Upon termination, any lease the Army proponent lease may jointly conduct the final closing using the ECP report funded with the lease that is certain is age change of the environmental condition of the subject property to lease the refuse to participate. The garrison commander Army proponent will conduct final assessment at the lease expense to provide a copy of the grantee the environmental significant change if it has acquired. It will be documented in a minute with the ECP report previous environmental assessment. If one is done with the lease, will be required to sustain the compensation. The lease will be made at war with the requirements procedure with the original lease document. Lease renewals. The ECP requirements must be met before the renewing the existing lease. If the lease does not have the environmental site assessment performed originally, the ECP must be done prior to the renewal. The renewal of the existing lease previously had an ECP. Other versions of the site assessment per document that the garrison community must be certain with the environmental conditions have to change. And if environmental significant change has occurred, it will be documented supply of amendment with the original assessment report. Environmental significant change involves the storage of hazardous substances for a year or more. The known releases of the substance or disposal on property. The revised report will process in accordance with the paragraph 15.5 and C above. Then a copy of the ECP report and an add submitted amendment will be provided with the grantee. See all the leases and easements, other special land uses in paragraph 4D3D2, the compensation reimbursement, agricultural grazing, outlease, forestry program, paragraph 43D8, table 52 summarizes the 55, table 5, 15.2 summarizes the documents required for the various types of the real property acquisition list and disposal. 15.1 shows the property disposal authorities. 15.2 shows documents required. 15.6 military composition, construction, morale, welfare, recreation, construction, army installation. Military construction included major and minor construction projects. Part of the military construction, army, the military construction, army reserve, military construction, national guard, army housing, family housing, defensive military construction, or MILCON, attendant services, MILCON, first principal guidance with the MILCON, planning of the environmental safety remediation area, Army Regulation 415.15, 210.20, moral welfare, recreation, core instruction included in Army appropriated funding, non-appropriated funding construction, depending on the type of the facility. A. The pre-construction site collection, preparation, environmental documentation, site survey, the consideration of advances in the planning of the will funding with other than the MILCON and the NAF. When the project proponent of the instruction installation responsible for funding executing environmental supply with a survey unexploded ordnance with the survey and associated documentation of the proposed military construction, military welfare, moral welfare, recreation, construction site before site selection installation will coordinate the site selection activities in supporting the installation management command regional office. When selecting a proposed site, the installation should consider location and avoid unnecessary environmental remediation mitigation costs. However, the installation should consider that using the existing infrastructure wisely to include locations that may require some degree of remediation mitigation. The final determination should be based on economic relative risk analysis. If a proposed project must be situated within an environmental sensitive area, with the Army cleanup program must be already clean and current with the responsibility of anticipated future land with the cost of design, construction, the mitigation measure required for the direct result milcon and the 8.5 of the projects of the military milcon funds, if included with the cost estimate description of the work of the Department of Defense 1391 fiscal year of the military construction project data, AR200 415 Department of DA PAM 415 provided guidance for the completing Department of Defense Form 1391 military construction and non-appropriated funding. Non-Army tenants of the insulated Army are responsible for the funding of the environmental surveys and the associated documentation of military construction and appropriated funded construction sites where they are users. This be the site categorization of the Installation Management Command, Army Service Component Command, and direct reporting use in the National Guard Bureau of the Army National Guard is responsible for certifying the site categorization site are classified in 3 of the following categories. Category 1, there's no reason to expect contamination will be encountered during the construction. Chapter 2, Category 2, there is no contamination that results in potential. For the remaining, some potential of the contamination may be encountered during construction. Category 3, the site is known to be contaminated. There is a strong suspicion of contamination will be encountered during the construction. Site clearance and standard site organization will be completed in accordance with the ASTM D6085-96 standard practice of conducting environmental baseline surveys, ASTM E152700 environmental site assessment, phase 1 site process, ASTM E1903 97 environmental site assessment, phase 2 site assessment processes. Discovered contamination installation of the military construction proponent responsible for remediation cleanup of the environmental contamination discovered during the execution of military construction not appropriated funded construction project. If removal discovered of the contamination adequately addressed the environmental condition of the property of the construction decision no further and it is secured but the installation project should be proceeded. If the initial response activities are not adequate, additional remediation cleanup is required but the project is responsible for identifying the environmental requirements of the securing funds, construction contractor costs such as direct delay costs unabsorbed for extended overhead, incidental discovery remediation cleanup. However, the military construction funded with the APF and the NAF funded is appropriate with the military moral welfare recreation projects extent with the determined with the Army and the responsible for the liable such costs. 15.7. The National Security Emergency Exemption Waiver. In condition with admission, the Garrison Command showed anticipate allowed the mission with the surge conditions that could result during the time of the national security emergencies include, but not limited to the contingency operations, suppression, insurrection, humanitarian, civilian assistance, peacekeeping activities, disaster relief in case of the mission surge conditions could potentially exceed permanent limits of the environmental requirements. The Garrison Commander should request exemptions in accordance with this section. The evaluation possible for the action of the Garrison Commander will consult with the legal counsel to determine the appropriateness of the seeking the environmental exemption waiver. In national security emergency, the requirement of the regulation remains in effect unless of the waiver of the Army commanding Army Chief of the Staff Installation Management. The Garrison Commander anticipates the surge of conditions could result in violation of federal, state, and environmental law or regulations. As soon as it's practical, the Garrison Commander should consult with the appropriate federal, state, and local authorities on the mutual agreement of the court of action. The satisfactory resolution but can be made agreed upon, but the Garrison Commander will submit a request for national security exemption to headquarters Department of the Army to DAIM-ED, though the chain of command, the request must include the identification of the action prompting needed for the exemption. The statute from which the exemption is sought with the applicable statutory exemption provision adequate supporting the information, the justification of the exemption, and alternatives considered, but the reasons were not adopted. The Army Chief of the Staff and Installation Management will coordinate the Army Staff and the elements with the founded with the request for the recommendation of the Army Secretary of the Inner Army Installation Environment, who may transmit the Office of Secretary of Defense for the disposition. In the event of the expectation of the denial but cannot be granted within a timely manner, the Army Chief of the Staff and the Installation Management will provide a specific guidance and resolution that conflicted the identified requests. 15.8. The Army Environmental Program Foreign Countries Policy. The section clarified the environmental policy requirements applicable to protect installation facilities located in the foreign country. The section does not apply to the training officer, installation deployments, contingency operation location, which the noted Department of Defense Environmental Executive Agent has been designated. Army policy of the foreign countries is complete with the applicable standards, criteria, the regulation, preserve, protect, enhance environmental quality, human life, or human health, and the standards and criteria of the regulation include the country's specific final governing standards, Department of Defense Instruction 47.15.5, Department of Instruction 47.15.8, and Executive Order 12.088, Executive Order 12.114. The final governing standard defines environmental standards. The Army protecting installation for the foreign country. The final governing standards presented over the requirements of regulation under the, unless otherwise specifically noted in the specification. Army facilities in foreign nation with no final governing standards will comply with the Department of Defense 417.05 with the applicable international agreements. Only designated the Department of Defense (EEA) can revise the final governing standards in this case when necessary to comply with the more protective criteria of the final governing standards prescribed with the governing garrison commander must consult with the EEA. Wherever the final governing standards may be granted by the Department of Defense designated by the EEA Unified Command with the combatant commanders in accordance with the country specific final governing standard, the Department of Defense and designated EEA waivers policy. Hazardous waste that cannot be disposed of in accordance with the final governing standards will be returned to the United States in any other location where the disposable criteria can be met. In addition, with compliance standards for the disposable Army organization activities will comply with the provision of the applicable status of the force of the agreement or SOFA, other legal binding international agreements, the reflection of the shipping of those storage of the hazardous waste and external environmental performance assessment system. The assessment will conduct with the overseas installation in accordance with the Department of Defense Instruction 4715. 5. Country-specific final governing standards generally with every 3 years environmental remediation overseas installation addressed with paragraph chapter 12.4 will be conducted in accordance with the Department of Defense Instruction 4715.8. Program requirements for overseas activities are addressed throughout the regulation. Additionally, with the Army Command, Management, the Army Surface Component Command, the Direct Reporting Units, the Installation Management Command. Installation will comply with the provision of the Department of Defense Instruction 4715.5, 4715.8. Appropriate construction specific implementation guides per the Department of Defense is designated with the EEA. Garrison Commander will consider the adverse impacts installation activity properly listed with the World Heritage List, European Union National Conservation Site, and importance in the host nation equivalent of the U.S. National Register of the historical places. Reasonable efforts will be provided to avoid mitigating the adversely effects. 3. The Garrison Commander will adversely impact the installation activities internationally protected with the animal and plant and species of the habitat, including the flora and fauna of the hazardous nation, host nation equivalent to the Endangered Species Act, Title 16 U.S. Standard Code 335 ESA, responsible effort for the provided to avoid minimizing adverse effects for such resources. Army compliance. The Army active reserve Army National Guard's participation with the operation will comply with the environmental annex specified with the combatant commands. For example, in Annex L with the operation planning, the Army commands will report overseas violation through the command channels to DAIMAED with courtesy of a copy of the Joint Judge L Environmental something. 15.9. Environmental Management System Documentation. Document controls. Installation will establish and maintain information within paper or electronic form to describe the core elements of the management system and their interaction. Provide direction with related documentation. Installations will establish and maintain procedures and control with all the documentation required the ISO 14000 standard, and to ensure that they can be located with that they are periodically reviewed, revised, and necessary to prove the adequacy of proof. Authorized personnel. The current versions and relative documents are available at all locations where they have operations essential with the effective function of the environmental management system performed with the obsolete documentation properly removed for all the points of the issue points that otherwise assured you against you unintended use and any obsolete documentation legal or knowledge preservation purposes are suitable identified. Documentation will be legible, dated with the date of the revision, readable, identified, maintained in an orderly manner, and retained with the specific period. Procedure responsibility will be established and maintained concerned with the creation, modification, various types of documentation. Chapter 6, Checking and Corrective Action.